It's been a little while since I've been up here and shared with you my thoughts and told you Bible stories and studied the Bible together. Today, I want to share a story with you that is 3,000 years old. And I want to see, amongst the kids especially, how long it takes for you to recognise this story. And if I wanted to give a clue away and say this is probably Gabriel's favourite story, then those of you that know Gabriel will know the story that we're going to look at today. So, like I said, it's a story that happened 3,000 years ago, and the kingdom of Israel was in its infancy. And it takes place in an area called the Shephelah. And the reason that we're going to look at this story again, because I know many of you have already looked at this story many times, but we're going to look at it again, is that each time I look at it, I learn a little bit more. I gain new understanding. And so today with you, I want to understand it like never before. Now, the Shephelah. It's probably the most beautiful part of Israel. In ancient Palestine, there was a mountain range along its eastern border. And those mountains are still there today, funnily enough. And the ancient cities are nestled in that mountain range. Jerusalem to the north, down through Bethlehem, and Hebron in the south. And there's a coastal plain along the Mediterranean Sea, the west coast, where Tel Aviv is now. And connecting the mountain range to the coastal plain is an area called the Shephelah. It's a series of valleys and ridges running east to west. And you go through the Shephelah to go from the coast up into the mountains. Like I said, it's a very beautiful and scenic part of Israel. There are wheat fields, there are vineyards, and there are forests of trees in certain areas. But importantly, to our story, these valleys served a very strategic purpose. The route by which hostile armies on the coastal plain travel up into the mountains and attack the people and the cities up there. And 3,000 years ago, that's exactly what happened. The Philistines, who are the worst enemy of the kingdom of Israel, are living on the coastal plain. Now, the Philistines are originally from Crete. They're a seafaring people, quite possibly the Minoans. And they start to make their way through one of the valleys in the Shephelah up into the mountains because they want to occupy the highland area right by Bethlehem, split the kingdom of Israel in two, just to divide and conquer. The Israeli Army Intelligence Service reports this to King Saul, and he brings his army down from the mountains and he confronts the Philistines in the valley of Elah. Now, we're going to try and bring up Google Earth live for you this morning so we can have a close look and see exactly where this happened 3,000 years ago. So you see the Mediterranean Sea there? And which one is the button for the laser? Is that it? Yep, that's it. All right. So this is Crete over here where the Philistines came from, and they settled on the coastal plain here of Israel. All right, Lachlan, let's zoom in here. All right. Now, I'm struggling to read that a little bit. Yep. Okay, so just up here, outside of picture, there it is. There's Jerusalem, and we come down a little bit, and there's Bethlehem there, and Hebron's even further to the south, down here. And where we've got this blue point on our map is the Valley of Elah. Now, the Valley of Elah runs all the way down around here, okay? This is the Valley of Elah. And if you open your Bibles, and this is giving it away finally, 1 Samuel chapter 17, it talks about the cities that are involved in this particular crisis, we'll call it, this particular story. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Okay, verse 1, the story starts in verse 1. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Socoh and Azekah." All right. Can you see that little white spot there? That's Socoh. And zoom back out just a little bit, Lachlan. There we go. And there's a crescent shape all around here. And there is the ancient city of Azekah. So the Philistines were camped in a crescent all the way around this side of the Valley of Elah. And then the Israelites were on this piece of land here that sticks up out of the valley, and that was the little town that they were defending. If we go, I can't remember how much further it is into chapter 17. Yeah, the Philistines stood on one side of the mountain, and the Israel stood on the other side with a valley between them. That little spot there where we've got our blue dot, people that like to dig holes looking for old things started looking there in the early 2000s, and what they found, whoops, that's not good for the microphone, we'll leave it there, it won't fall any further. What they found was absolutely incredible. The name of that little town, and I'm kicking myself, I should know it off the top of my head. It talks about it here in chapter 17. Means two gates. That's the name of that little town. And when they finally dug it up, guess what they found? Two gates. Now, most cities in ancient Palestine of this size only had one gate for protection purposes. You could only get in and out of the city one way. And chapter 17 talks about this city called Two Gates, and that's exactly what they found at that little spot there. All right, let's keep going. Back to our PowerPoint. The two armies just sit there. So that's what it looks like today. That's what the Valley of Elah looks like today. The Israelites are encamped along here, and this is where the Philistines are, all the way around there. This is almost the same spot that this picture's taken from again. The Israelites are up on this bit here, and the Philistines are based in a crescent all the way around here. The two armies just sit there and stare at each other for weeks because they're deadlocked. Neither could attack the other, because to attack the other, they'd have to go down into the valley, cross it, and then up the other side where they'd be at a significant disadvantage, having to attack the enemy who is above you. That doesn't work, does it? You always want to be on the high ground when you're in battle. So in an attempt to break the deadlock, the Philistines send their mightiest warrior down into the valley floor. You guys know what the story is yet? Yeah, you do? Good. He calls out and he challenges the Israelites. And he says, send your mightiest warrior down and we'll have this out. We'll sort this out, just the two of us. This was a done thing in ancient warfare. It was called single combat, in an attempt to minimise bloodshed while settling the disputes. If there was a major battle, obviously many people would die or be wounded. But this way, only one person would die. You know, the ancients believed that gods often decided who would win the battle anyway. So there was no point in all their soldiers being killed or wounded. Let's just get two to fight. A much better idea. The ancient Egyptians used it. Other civilizations around the Mediterranean used it. Menelaus and Paris, and later Achilles and Hector in the story of the Iliad used it. And later then again, Nennius of Britain and Julius Caesar fought single combat as recorded in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. So this was nothing unusual. Anyway, the Philistine champion that is sent down is a giant. He's outfitted from head to toe in the latest and greatest bronze armour. He's got a huge sword and a heavy spear, and this giant is absolutely terrifying. He's so terrifying that none of the Israeli soldiers will fight him. It's a death wish. There's no way they could win against him. This giant comes out every day and yells insults and obscenities at the Israeli army, taunting them to come out and fight him. If I win, you will be our slaves. If you win, we will be your slaves. Fair deal? Bit lopsided. Uli, you up to fighting this guy? Nah. Call me chicken. I'm not going. I'm not going. While this is going on a little farm just outside of Bethlehem, a mother and a father are sending their youngest son on an errand. You see, their three oldest sons had signed up under the handsome King Saul and were with the Israeli camped out on the hillside overlooking the Elah Valley. And they're worried about their three boys because they're off at war. And I don't have to tell you that war is not a nice thing. And if you had three sons or three brothers off at war, you'd be pretty worried sick too. But they didn't want to show that too much to the youngest boy, and they sent him on an errand. Said, look, your brothers are going to be hungry. So, Mum hands him a backpack and says, here are some egg and lettuce sandwiches for your brothers. Go and check on them, please. Make sure they're okay. We want them to know that we're thinking of them and praying for their victory. Tell them that Mum said that they must keep up with their laundry and they must wear clean undies every day. She doesn't want them wounded or killed in dirty undies. And here are some tomato and cheese sandwiches for that nice captain of theirs too. I know he likes cheese. So off went young David. He travelled as light as he could because it was about 35 or so kilometres from where they lived to the valley of Elah. He had the backpack of sandwiches over his shoulder, his sling hanging from his belt, and his shepherd's staff in his hand. I reckon it took him about a day. 35 kilometres, that's a good day's walk. And when he got there, he handed out the sandwiches, even though the lettuce had wilted a bit and the egg was starting to get a little whiffy. And the cheese and tomato sandwiches for the captain were really soggy by now, because I know how soggy they are by lunchtime. Then David heard this giant's voice yelling up from the valley below, being very disrespectful about the Israeli army and their God. And he asked who this huge fellow was. And won't anyone stand up for the fight? What's wrong with yous? We can't let him talk about us and our God like that. That's not okay. Look, if no one will fight him, I will. His brothers stand there with their mouths open and they try to get him to give up this crazy idea and go back home to mum. But David's not having a bar of it. And he gets taken to King Saul and he says, I'll go fight him. And Saul says, that's ridiculous. No way, you're just a kid. That Gigantor's a mighty warrior and you're just a kid. And David says, hold on. I know what I'm doing. I've been guarding my sheep for years. I've already fought off and killed lions and wolves and bears. This guy won't be a problem. Besides, God is on my side. Lesson 1 from this story. Your perspective will determine your destiny. Goliath was too big. He was too big to King Saul and he was too big to David, but in different ways. From Saul's perspective, he was too big to defeat. Nobody could take care of this big fella. There was just no possible physical way to take down this giant. From David's perspective, Goliath was too big to miss. As long as you chuck a stone in his general direction, you're going to get him, aren't you? He's too big to miss. Saul finally says, righto, because Saul's mind had run out of options 40 days ago. And Saul quickly realised that this was still ridiculous, so he insisted that David wear his armour. David climbed into his armour and there were 2 problems. Only 2. David had never used or worn armour before, so he had no idea what to do with it. He couldn't move in it. He didn't know how to balance himself properly, how to move his joints. He didn't have the strength in the right muscles to support it. And second problem, it just didn't fit. So David said to Saul, I can't wear this. I've no idea what to do with it. I'm not used to it. Forget it. I'm taking it off. The biblical account says that David said, I have not proved it. What's it going to do for me? I don't know what it's going to do for me. I reckon it's going to be useless. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. So off little David goes. One lonely shepherd boy to face Goliath, the giant from Gath, down the side of the ridge from the encampment to the little stream running past below. And as he crosses the creek, he bends down and carefully chooses 5 smooth stones and puts them in his shepherd's bag. And then he heads off towards the giant. The giant sees this figure heading towards him, and he calls out in his usual taunting way, "Come to me, so I can feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." And the young shepherd draws closer and closer. The giant can see that he's only carrying a staff, and there's no sword and no spear or javelin, no real weapons, just this shepherd's staff. So the giant is insulted, and he questions, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Let's read it. If you've got your Bibles with you, 1 Samuel 17. And let's start at verse 45. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 45. This is how young David responds to Goliath's question. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Here it is. Verse 45, "Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp to the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." David's a brave little fella, isn't he? Absolutely incredible. You know, Goliath says to him, "Come here so I can rip bits off your body and feed them to the birds and the animals." And David says, that's not how it's going to be. It's going to be the other way around. But I'm not just going to take your body. Oh, I'm good at this, aren't I? I'm not going to take just your body. I'm going to take the bodies of every person that's in the Philistine camp and do that. So I'm going to see your one body and raise you thousands. We're going to do this properly. Then the shepherd boy takes one of his stones out of his pocket and he puts it in his sling, twirls it round and lets fly, and hits the giant right in the forehead. Smack! There's a sickening thud and the giant falls over on his face. David, because as we know he doesn't have a sword of his own, runs over, grabs the huge sword, struggles to lift it up, and then cuts off the giant's head. And the Philistines see this, so they just turn and run. So God, using this little shepherd boy, delivers a huge victory into the hands of the Israelites. So David in this story is the underdog, right? The saying, "a David and Goliath fight," has even entered our language as a metaphor for an improbable victory in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. Yes? Why do we call David an underdog? We call him an underdog because he's a little kid, and Goliath is this big, strong giant. We also call him an underdog because Goliath is an experienced and trained warrior, and David is just a shepherd with no formal combat training or experience like Goliath has. And most importantly, we call David an underdog because Goliath is outfitted with all this modern armour and weaponry, this glittering coat of bronze armour and this huge sword and this incredibly heavy spear, and all little David has is just his simple sling. Let's focus on that for a minute. All David has is his sling, because that's the first mistake we make. In ancient warfare, there are broadly 3 different kinds of warriors in the army. There's the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery. The infantry are the armoured foot soldiers that are equipped for hand-to-hand combat. The cavalry, which move very quickly on horseback or in chariots, and then the artillery, which are your archers and slingers. Archers use bows and arrows, and slingers use a sling to hurl a projectile, a metal ball or a stone. The projectile gets put in the leather pouch of the sling and they whirl it around and round. The projectile is released and it flies towards its target. And that's what David has. It's important to understand that's what David has. It's not a slingshot, not one of these, not a kid's toy, but a sling, an accurate and deadly weapon. When David whirls the sling around, he does so at about 7 revolutions per second. And when he lets go and the stone flies out of the sling, it flies out at 35 to 40 metres per second. Now, I promise you, if you drove your car that fast, you'd get a ticket and lose your licence. And if you bowled that fast, you'd have a good chance of making the Australian cricket team because it's over 140 kilometres an hour. Lesson 2. Your skills are exactly what is needed. Your skills are exactly what God needs from you. He's given them to you. He needs you to use them from him. Take a hold of what skills and gifts you've been given. It might seem small compared to the armour that you're facing, but if used correctly, could make any giant fall. Who has giants in their life? I was going to say, nobody's putting their hand up. You're all liars. Every single one of you. Every single one of you has giants in your life. I know I do. And I'm no one special. All right? Everybody has giants in their life. God has given you the skills that you need to deal with them. You might not know it yet. You might not know what those skills are, but I promise you, God has given you the skills that you need to deal with those giants. Now, further to this with young David. Yes, picture of some ancient slingers. They were really, really important in the armies of that day. The stones in the valley of Elah are barium sulfate, which is about twice as dense as normal river stones. If you do the calculations on the stopping power of the rock, the amount of energy that dissipates into a target when it's hit, it's roughly the same as a .45 caliber handgun. The sling is an incredibly devastating weapon. We know from historical records that experienced slingers could maim or kill from distances of up to 200 metres. Medieval slingers could hit birds in flight. They were incredibly accurate. When David lines up to hit Goliath, and he's much closer than 200 yards, he has every intention and expectation that he will hit his target with deadly results. If you go back over history, you'll find that time and time again, slingers were the decisive factor against infantry in many battles. So what is Goliath? He's heavy infantry. And he was expecting to face heavy infantry when he challenged the Israelites to single combat. He thought he was going to be fighting another heavy infantryman, someone else weighed down by similar weighty armour and carrying a huge stabbing spear or maybe a two-handed battle sword. When he says, "Come to me so I may feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the fields," the main bit is, come to me. Come, let's fight in hand-to-hand and face-to-face combat. Saul had the same expectation. David says, I want to fight this Goliath guy. And so Saul tries to put on the big heavy armour on him. And again, because Saul is expecting hand-to-hand combat, infantry to infantry. But that's not part of David's plan. David has no expectation of getting that close to Goliath. Why would he fight him that way? He's a shepherd. He spent his entire life using his sling to keep his safe sheep from lions and wolves. And that's where his strength lies. So here he is, this shepherd, experienced in using this devastating weapon up against this lumbering giant, weighed down by over 100 pounds of armour, a number of heavy weapons that are only useful in short-range hand-to-hand combat. Goliath is a sitting duck. He doesn't have a chance. So why do we keep calling David an underdog, and why do we keep referring to his victory as improbable? There's a second piece of this that's important. It's not only that we misunderstand David and his choice of weaponry, it's also that we profoundly misunderstand Goliath. Goliath is not what he seems to be. There is all kinds of hints to this in the biblical text, things that in retrospect are quite puzzling and don't square with his image as this mighty warrior. So to begin with, the Bible says that Goliath is led onto the valley floor to battle by an attendant, by a shield bearer. Now, big strong guy like Goliath, do you really think he needs a shield bearer? The shield bearer is going to probably be a young boy. Do you think he's even strong enough to carry Goliath's shield? Isn't that a little weird? Here is this mighty warrior challenging the Israelites to one-on-one combat. Why is he being led by some young boy by the hand out into the battleground? And actually the Bible kind of implies that the giant moved very slowly, which is odd to say about possibly the mightiest warrior in the world at the time. Then there's this whole thing about how long it takes for Goliath to react to the sight of David. So David is coming down the side of the ridge into the valley of Elah, And he's clearly not preparing for hand-to-hand combat. There's nothing about him that says, I'm going to fight you like this with my big sword and my spear. Nothing about David that says that. Why doesn't Goliath react to that? It's as if he's oblivious to what's going on around him. And then there's this strange comment he makes to David. Am I a dog that you should come to me with sticks? Sticks? David only has one stick. His shepherd's staff. Well, it turns out that there's been a great deal of speculation among the medical community over the years whether there is something fundamentally wrong with Goliath in an attempt to make sense of all these apparent anomalies. There have been many articles written, and the first was in the 1960s in the Indiana Medical Journal. And it started a chain of speculation that starts with an explanation for Goliath's height. So Goliath is head and shoulders above all his peers in that army. When someone is that far out of the norm, there is an explanation for it. The most common form of giantism is a condition called acromegaly. And it's caused by a benign tumour on the pituitary gland that causes an overproduction of human growth hormone. And throughout history, many of the most famous giants that we know about have had acromegaly. Robert Wadlow was the tallest man ever alive in modern history, and he was still growing when he died at the age of 24. He was 8'11". He had acromegaly. Do you remember a famous actor and wrestler called Andre the Giant? He had acromegaly. If you've ever watched the movie The Princess Bride, you'll know who this guy is. Tony Robbins. You know who Tony Robbins is? Well-known motivational speaker. Very famous, probably the most well-known motivational speaker. Has acromegaly. There's even speculation that Abe Lincoln had acromegaly. Acromegaly has a very distinct set of symptoms that goes along with it, principally to do with vision. The pituitary tumour, as it grows, often starts to compress on the optic nerves. As a result, people with acromegaly often have double vision and are profoundly nearsighted. So when people speculate about what might have been wrong with Goliath, they say, wait a minute, he looks and sounds a lot like someone who's got acromegaly. And that would explain so much about his strange behaviour on that day. Why does he move so slowly, and why does he have to be escorted down to the combat area? Because he can't make his own way down. Why is he so strangely oblivious to David when he doesn't understand that David's not going to fight him until the very last moment? It's because he can't see him that far away. When he says, "Come to me so I might feed your flesh to the birds and the beasts," the phrase "come to me" is also a hint of his vulnerability. Come to me because I can't see you. And then there's the, am I a dog that you should come to me with sticks? Did he see 2 sticks instead of the 1? So the Israelites up on the mountain ridge, looking down on him, thought he was this extraordinarily powerful foe. What they didn't understand was that the very thing that was the source of his apparent strength was also the source of his greatest weakness. Your giant that you are facing today probably isn't as strong as you think. You've built him up in your mind. He's been yelling at you for 40 days. And he's created a perception in your mind that's not accurate. The enemy's perceived advantages can often mask their even bigger disadvantages. Giants are not as powerful as they seem, and sometimes the shepherd boy is a sharpshooter with a sling in his pocket.